students. Now this video is regarding the blood supply of the brainstem and spinal cord. Okay, in the last video we learned about the blood supply of the cortical branches which were supplying to the cerebral cortex on superolateral, medial and the inferior surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, in this video, first we will learn about what are the blood vessels which are supplying to the midbrain, pons, medulla, and spinal cord, and then along with this I will also tell you about what are the applied importance, okay, clinical aspect of the occlusion of these blood vessels are because of the hemorrhage of these blood vessels supplying to the brain stem and to the spinal cord. Now, this diagram shows you the part of the midbrain, pons and medulla, and posterior to the pons and medulla is the cerebellum. Now, you can see the blood vessels here which are supplying. Let us see, this is the basilar artery which lies in front of the pons in the basilar groove. So, this is the basilar artery which is formed by the union of the right and left vertebral artery at the lower margin of the pons, and near the upper margin of the pons this basilar artery will divide into two terminal branches, and these branches are the posterior cerebral arteries. Okay, now if you see this vertebral artery, then you will see that on the posterolateral aspect, each vertebral artery on right and left side gives a branch what is called as the posterior spinal artery, and this posterior spinal artery runs along the posterolateral groove of the spinal cord. Then this artery also gives the branch which unite in the midline to form the anterior spinal artery, and this anterior spinal artery runs in the median fissure of the spinal cord. So there are three spinal artery, the two posterior spinal artery and a single anterior spinal artery which will go down to form the blood supply to the spinal cord. Now, this vertebral artery then just close to that of the pyramid, it will give another branch here, and this is the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, cerebellar, because it is going to the inferior posterior part of the inferior aspect of the cerebellum. But from the basilar artery and another artery will come what is called as the anterior inferior cerebellar, not posterior but the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So the inferior surface of the cerebellum will be supplied by the two cerebellar artery. One is the posterior inferior and another is the anterior inferior, while the superior surface of the cerebellum is supplied by the artery which is called as the superior cerebellar artery. Okay, so both the surfaces of cerebellum are supplied by this artery. In this diagram we are also seeing many branches taking origin from the pontine, from that of the basilar artery, and these branches are called as the pontine artery. So these are the vessels which are supplying here to the brainstem part and to the cerebellum. Now let us concentrate only on to the which are the arteries which will supply to the midbrain only. Okay, so this is the cross section: midbrain, cerebral aqueduct, cerebral peduncles, and on posterior aspect are the colliculi. So this is the midbrain. Let us see which are the branches which will only supply to the midbrain. Midbrain is supplied by branches coming from the basilar artery which will run upward. Okay, then from this superior cerebellar, this is the superior, this will also give many branches to that of the midbrain. So second number is the superior cerebellar. The third branch, most of the branches which are taking origin as a short branch from anterolateral aspect, okay, of this posterior cerebral. It is cerebral, not cerebellar. So this is the posterior cerebral artery. This will also give many branches to the midbrain. Thus we see that the three arteries and their branches, I mean to say branches from these three arteries are responsible to supply the midbrain: basilar, superior cerebellar, and the posterior cerebral. Okay, posterior. Let us go to see this diagram, which is from the ventral aspect. We are seeing the blood supply. In the previous diagram we were seeing it from the lateral aspect. Here again this is the right and left vertebral arteries are seen, and this is the anterior cerebral artery which runs in the anterior median fissure, and then this will be the two posterior cerebral arteries which are on the posterolateral sulcus, which I will show you again when I will teach you the blood supply of the spinal cord. Okay, now let us see here which are the arteries which gives blood supply to the pons. These are the branches taking origin from the basilar artery, and these arteries are multiple and they are known as the Pontine artery. So this is the branches from the basilar artery number one. Then it is from superior cerebellar. I told you that just before it divides into two terminal branches, that is posterior cerebral. Okay, the artery is given here at the upper margin of the pons. This is superior cerebellar. So the superior cerebellar and the basilar, they are the major supply to the pons, and then it is also supplied by the anterior inferior cerebellar. So anterior inferior cerebellar, which is designed to supply the superior surface of the cerebellum. So there are three arteries: basilar, superior cerebellar, and anterior inferior cerebellar, which will supply the blood to the pons. Let us see which arteries will supply the blood to the medulla. Okay, medulla, as we have seen, this is the anterior cerebral, anterior spinal, and this was the two posterior spinal arteries. So anterior and posterior spinal arteries, they will supply to the medulla here. Okay, as they are going down to the supply to the spinal cord, they will also give branch to the medulla, but major portion of the blood to the medulla will come from the posterior inferior cerebellar. Okay, this is the posterior inferior cerebellar. This was the anterior inferior cerebellar. This is the posterior inferior. This will supply to the major part of the medulla. Okay, so three branches: anterior and posterior spinal arteries, and the posterior inferior cerebellar will supply blood to the medulla oblongata. Let us come to the arterial supply of the midbrain and the clinical condition associated if these arteries are blocked. Let us see that we have learned already that three different branches they supply to the midbrain: basilar artery, superior cerebellar, and posterior cerebral arteries. I have shown you in the previous slide. Okay, now if these arteries are blocked, or if there takes place some hemorrhage, okay, and because of this blockage of artery, or the, say for example, cerebrovascular accident, okay, a syndrome will take place, what is called as the Weber's and Benedikt's syndrome. The two different syndrome will take place. Now if the posterior cerebral artery is occluded, okay, the posterior cerebral, okay, which was the terminal branch of the basilar artery at the upper margin of the pons, okay, which is responsible for the major supply to the midbrain. If posterior cerebral artery is occluded, say for example, if it is occluded on one side, okay, the posterior cerebral artery, this will lead to a syndrome which is called as Weber's syndrome. Okay, Weber's syndrome. See this area, okay, this area is showing that of the infarct, or the tissue is dead in the midbrain, okay, where this artery was supplying on this side. Okay, this is the Weber syndrome, and here it will be the tracts which are going in this area, they will be, I mean to say, affected, and these are the corticospinal and the corticonuclear tract, okay, which will ultimately form the pyramid. Okay, pyramid. So this is corticospinal, means from the precentral gyrus area number 4, these fibers are going to the various levels of the spinal cord, supplying to the skeletal muscle. Okay, so this is the corticospinal fibers. Then corticonuclear fibers are going from the motor area to the various motor nuclei of the cranial nerves. That's why it is called as corticonuclear. Okay, and because of this lesion, okay, of the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers in Weber syndrome, there will occur the paralysis of the opposite side of the body. And why to the opposite side of body? Because these corticospinal fiber, they cross to the opposite side in pyramidal decussation in medulla. Okay, so that's why below this, all the fibers of the corticospinal, okay, they will lead to the paralysis in the opposite half of the body. Okay, and then it will be the lower face will go. Okay, paralysis of the lower face will go, and the tongue paralysis will be go. Why it will be the lower face and the tongue paralysis will be go? Because this fibers which are going to the facial muscles, okay, lower facial muscle will also be affected. Okay, will also be affected. So it will be the lower face, okay, and the tongue will be affected here, okay, because of the corticonuclear fibers, because of the corticonuclear fibers which on the same side. Okay. Then there is a nerve going through this area, which is the area of the lesion. Okay, see this nerve, and this is the nerve coming from the third cranial nerve, oculomotor nerve. And because of this paralysis of the muscle supplied by the third cranial nerve, oculomotor, then the lateral rectus muscle, okay, which is not supplied by the oculomotor, will become active, and therefore the lateral squint will be there. Okay, lateral squint will be there by abducent nerve. Okay, by the abducent nerve. So this will, because of the paralysis of the muscle supplied by the oculomotor nerve, okay, intact nerve is the lateral rectus muscle, okay, supplied by the abducent nerve, that will become active, and hence this will pull the eye towards lateral side, move the eye towards lateral side. Okay, now because of this levator palpebral superioris muscle, okay, will be also paralyzed, because it is also supplied by the oculomotor nerve, and that's why the drooping of the upper eyelid will take place. Okay, it is the upper eyelid droopings. Now this, along with the fibers of the oculomotor nerve, this is also carrying the fibers from for that of the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is present at this level. And Edinger-Westphal nucleus is a parasympathetic preganglionic nucleus. Okay, that means neurons present in Edinger-Westphal nucleus, they are the presympathetic, containing presympathetic paraganglionic or preganglionic nucleus, I mean say neurons. Okay, and this will also be destroyed here because of this I mean to say damage to that of the oculomotor nerve, because it is containing parasympathetic fibers, and because of that there will occur the dilatation of pupil, because it is due to the overactivity of the sympathetic fibers. They become active because parasympathetic fibers are gone, and then there will be the loss of the accommodation reflex. Okay, loss of the accommodation reflex. So because of this parasympathetic damage, there will be the two different, I mean to say, dilatation of pupil and accommodation reflex is lost. Okay, that will be seen. Now this is the syndrome which is called as the Weber syndrome. It is called as Weber syndrome, and this is due to the occlusion of the artery, okay, which are going to supply to that of the midbrain, okay, midbrain area. Now let us go to the area which is more laterally, I mean to say another syndrome is here, and that syndrome is that is called as Benedikt syndrome. And in this Benedikt syndrome, everything is same except that here the lesion is also involving to that of the red nucleus. See, this red nucleus is involved here. Okay, and that's why most of the thing will be just similar to the Weber syndrome. Okay, but except the part, because this red nucleus is the part of the pyramid, I mean say this extra pyramidal system, motor system, as well as the efferent fibers which are arising from the red nucleus. They will be, I mean say, cerebellar fibers, efferent cerebellar fibers. They are destroyed along with the red nucleus. So beside this Weber syndrome symptoms, there will be one more, and there will be the cerebellar tremors will be seen. Okay, cerebellar, because of the involvement of the red nucleus. So these are the two clinical conditions which are associated because of the occlusion of the artery supplying to the midbrain. Okay, from the posterior cerebral arteries or superior cerebellar. Okay, let's move to the next slide where I will show you the blood supply of the pons. Since we have already learned about the blood supply of the pons is from the basilar artery, from pontine branches, and these are the arteries which will be mainly supplying pontine branches of the basilar artery. They are the main supply to the pons, and I mean to say they lie on the ventral to the pons in the pontine group. Okay, now if there is an occlusion of this artery, okay, a limited area will be affected, but if there is a hemorrhage in this artery takes place, the blood will diffuse to a wide spread area, and there will be lot of problems will be there. So pontine hemorrhage is always more severe, more serious as compared to the blockage of pontine arteries. Okay, now, this pontine hemorrhage will lead to the hemiplegia on opposite side. Hemiplegia, paralysis of muscle on the opposite side due to involvement of the corticospinal fibers. See here, here will be corticospinal fibers are going, so they are will be crossing to the opposite side at pyramidal decussation, so the paralysis will be always on to the opposite side. Okay, and then the facial paralysis will be on the same side. Okay, it will lead to the facial paralysis onto the same side due to the facial nucleus. See, this is the facial nucleus at the pontine level, and this is the abducent nerve nucleus, right? So if in the pontine hemorrhage this nerve and the nucleus is also damaged, and because of this there will be the facial paralysis of the same side, but on the opposite side will be the paralysis of the limbs and trunk. Okay, if extensive hemorrhage, then bilateral paralysis of body and face may occur. That means if this hemorrhage is only on one side, this will there, but if it is extensive, it may extend on both the side of the pons, means on either side of the midline, right and left, and then there will be the bilateral paralysis of body and face. This will also lead to the hyperpyrexia, high-grade fever, due to the involvement of the sympathetic fibers. It will lead to the involvement of the sympathetic fibers in reticular formation. Okay, so there is a damage of the sympathetic fibers which are present into the reticular formation, and because of that there will be the hyperpyrexia, because parasympathetic will become overactive. Now, there will be the deep coma due to the damage of the reticular formation. Okay, so the conscious centers of the reticular formation will get damaged. Okay, and that's why there will be the deep coma will take place. And because of the loss of the sympathetic fibers, there will be the constriction of pupil because of the overactivity of the parasympathetic. Okay, will takes place. So the patient will show the constriction of the pupil, and this is because of the I mean say damage to that of the reticular necrosis, okay, of the reticular formation. Now then you will see that there is a damage to the vital center of reticular formation contains the various vital center, for example the cardiovascular center, respiratory centers, okay, centers for the consciousness, okay, they all will go, okay, will be damaged, and because of the damage to these centers may lead to the sudden death, okay, it may lead to the sudden death. Let us see the pontine branches of the basilar artery when it is blocked, occlusion. There it was the pontine hemorrhage. Here it is the occlusion. And because of the occlusion, which will be, I mean to say, have a limited lesion, okay, because there are multiple pontine arteries are present on either side, taking origin from basilar artery. And then there will be a limited lesion will takes place due to occlusion. It is not like that of the hemorrhage as we have seen in the previous slide. Now this condition will lead to the many conditions, okay, I mean occlusion will lead to the many conditions. In the first slide it is shown as the Raymond syndrome, okay, and here we are seeing that the area include I mean say occlusion area will damage to this part which is containing the corticospinal and corticonuclear fiber. So again the opposite hemiplegia or paralysis, okay, and this from this area also the nerve is going, and this is that of the nerve which is going to the lateral rectus abducent now, okay, it is going. So what will happen that when one will try to see on lateral side, the eye will deviate towards medial side. So this is the abducent nerve paralysis will take place. And in this, if you see, if you ask a person to see on one side, both the eyes will see on one side. But in this one eye which is affected, paralyzed, lateral rectus is gone, then the other muscles will pull it towards the medial side. So this will lead to the medial squint, okay. So this is the Raymond's syndrome. Second syndrome is more little extensive in the lesion which has taken place. It is involving also the facial now, okay. It is not only the abducent, facial, and part of the spinal tract, okay, corticospinal tract part, not complete, okay. Uh, so this syndrome is called as Millard-Gruber syndrome. Millard-Gruber syndrome, and this will lead to the hemiparesis. That means partly there will be the loss of the functions, okay, in the muscles of the opposite side of the body, and there will be the facial paralysis on the same side, okay. This will be, and this also will lead to the effect onto the lateral rectus muscle, because abducent nerve is also gone here, right, along with the facial nerve. Facial nerve has gone. This will also lead to the abducent nerve. So there may be Millard-Gruber syndrome, that is weakness of the muscle on opposite side, facial paralysis on same side, and it may be the eye will deviate towards medial side. The third syndrome here is when there is a more extensive area is involved, that is called as Fovley syndrome, and here again the medial squint due to the interruption of, I mean say in the pathway of that of the abducent nerve and that of the facial. Both the facial nerve and the abducent nerves are affected, so there will be facial paralysis on same side and the medial squint on the same side. That is called as Fovley syndrome. But here there will be no I mean say paralysis onto the opposite side due to the involvement of the corticospinal tract, okay. This completes the Pons. Let us come to the blood supply of medulla, and medulla is supplied by the anterior and posterior spinal artery, as I have shown you in the earlier slide, and then it is also supplied by the posterior inferior cerebellar, posterior inferior cerebellar, and anterior and posterior spinal arteries. Now this will lead to the hemorrhage, okay. If it is due to the hemorrhage, okay, clinical condition. If these blood vessels will hemorrhage, will rupture, then hemorrhage will take place and the blood will spread into the large area, and that may involve also the reticular formation. You can see here, this is the pyramid of the medulla. Okay, this is the medial lemniscus, this is the olivary nucleus, inferior olivary. Okay, and this is the 12th cranial nerve nucleus, hypoglossal nucleus. Okay, and if the hemorrhage takes place here because of the medial arteries, especially those of the anterior spinal arteries, which have so sends the branches in the from the furrow to the deep inside, then what will be here, there will be the reticular formation which is present here. That will be, I mean to say, centers, vital centers present, that is respiration, circulation and conscious, they are all destroyed. Okay, they are all this, and it is usually fatal. Person may die. Okay, person may die here because of this fatalness. Now, if it instead of the hemorrhage there is an occlusion, okay, then through the branch of the branches of anterior spinal artery, this will lead to two syndrome. Okay, and it will be limited: medial medullary syndrome, medial medullary syndrome, as it is shown in this picture, medial medullary syndrome. And this medial medullary syndrome will lead to cross or alternating paralysis, easy to diagnose. Okay, where is the vascular lesion or occlusion has taken place. Muscle of the tongue is paralyzed on same side. Why? Because the hypoglossal nerve is passing through the area of the lesion. So muscle on the same side is paralyzed. And second is there is a motor paralysis because whole of the pyramidal tract is gone, which will cross and will go to the opposite side as the corticospinal tract. Okay, so the motor paralysis will take place onto the opposite side. Okay, and the tongue will paralyze onto the same side. That is called as the I mean to say, medial medullary syndrome. Let us go to the lateral medullary syndrome. And in the lateral medullary syndrome, there is the occlusion of the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. In the medial, it was the anterior spinal artery which was occluded. In the posterior medial cerebellar artery will lead to the lateral medullary syndrome, which is also called as Wallenberg syndrome. Here will be the loss of pain and temperature on opposite side. Loss of pain and temperature onto the opposite side, and this is due to the lateral spinothalamic tract. It is due to the lateral, and lateral spinothalamic tract carries the fibers. It carries the fibers which I mean to say, carry the pain and temperature. So loss of pain and temperature will be there on because it is bringing the fibers from opposite side of the body. Okay, so though the lesion is on this side, okay, and the lateral spinothalamic tract here is destroyed, but the fibers were coming from this side. Okay, after crossing in the spinal cord, then there will be the loss of pain and temperature on same side of the face. And why it should be on same side? Because in the same side the nucleus of spinal, now I mean say spinal nucleus and its tract are also destroyed, which are bringing the pain and temperature fibers from the same side of the face. So it is cross. That means the loss of pain and temperature on the opposite side below the neck, but in the face it is on the same side. Okay, loss of pain and temperature on the face. Okay, now there may be the ataxia of the gait and limbs on the same side, and this is because this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle is also destroyed here. Okay, and that means it is under the lesion. Okay, that is inferior cerebellar peduncle which is bringing the fibers, okay, for the conscious proprioceptive sensation, I mean say unconscious proprioceptive sensation. Now this, there will be the paralysis of the pharynx, larynx and soft palate. Okay, why? Why there will be the paralysis of pharynx, larynx? Because this is the nucleus ambiguous, and nucleus ambiguous is responsible to supply the motor fiber to that of the muscles of the larynx, pharynx and to the soft palate. So there will be paralysis of the larynx, pharynx and the soft palate on that side. Then there may be the nausea, vomiting and vertigo. Why nausea, vomiting and vertigo will take place? Because this vestibular nucleus is also under the lesion, okay, on that side. So there will be the nausea, vomiting and vertigo because of the vestibular nuclear lesion. So this will be many lesions which will take place due to the occlusion or the hemorrhage for the medulla. Now coming quickly to the blood supply of the spinal cord. You can see here these are the two posterior spinal arteries which are going on the posterolateral sulcus, and this is the anterior spinal artery joining from the branches of the right and left vertebral artery. It will run in the median fissure. This is the transverse section showing the anterior spinal artery, and this is the posterior spinal artery of this side and posterior spinal artery of that. So there are the three spinal arteries which runs vertically, okay, both anterior one and two posterior, they run vertically, and at the same time at each spinal segmental level you also get the segmental artery which runs into the ventral spinal root and the dorsal spinal root. This we can see better in the next diagram. Here these are the segmental arteries. See, this is the thoracic aorta and gives branches, and from these branches, segmental branches, arteries, they go at each intervertebral foramina level into the spinal cord through the ventral and dorsal this root, spinal root. This will show you a clear picture here. This is the anterior median fissure, this is the posterolateral sulcus, and then the anterior horn, the posterior horn, gray horn, and then this is the posterior spinal root, and this is the anterior spinal root. Now three vertically running artery where the posterior spinal artery on right side and posterior on left side, and this is the anterior spinal artery, and they sends the branches inside, okay, to supply the spinal cord on either side. At the segmental level, many segmental artery, they come anterior radicular artery which passes through the anterior horn cell, not anterior horn, by the anterior spinal root, okay, and then it also anastomose with the anterior spinal artery. It will send the branches onto the lateral side, from anterior side, from the medial side through the anterior median fissure groove here, and this is the posterior radicular branch which will also anastomose with the branches of the posterior spinal artery. Thus, if you will see here, the anterior spinal artery and associated branches are responsible for the ventral two-third supply of the spinal. Ventral two-third. This much part is supplied by the anterior spinal artery, which is reinforced by the segmental, while the posterior one-third part of the spinal cord is supplied by that of the posterior spinal arteries. Okay. Now, if there will be this will again show you. See this is the anterior spinal artery, and at segmental artery will come and join this anterior spinal artery from right as well as left side. These are the two posterior spinal artery, and they will be also joined by the posterior radicular artery. This is the anterior radicular artery. In this way, the long spinal cord of 45 centimeter is supplied by the blood. Okay. Now, if there is an occlusion of the anterior spinal artery here, which was placed here, anterior spinal artery was placed here and then was sending the branches medially and then from ventral aspect, and as I said that the ventral two-third part of the spinal cord is supplied by the anterior, and this artery gets occluded due to thrombosis or any other region, this will lead to the paraplegia. Paraplegia means this is the paralysis of the body below the lesion, and mostly the lower two limbs are gone, both right as well left. Paralysis is on both the side of the trunk and the lower limb. So paraplegia and sensory loss below the lesion, because both the side it is taking place. So sensory loss will be also on both the sides. This is just in contrast to hemiplegia, where the motor loss and the sensory loss was only in one half of the body. Here it is on both the side. Okay, listen. And this is due to the damage to the corticospinal and spinothalamic tract. Spinothalamic tract, they are sent here upward, carrying the sensation on both the side. So both the corticospinal tract are gone, spinothalamic tract are gone, which are carrying the sensation of pain and temperature, and the corticospinal tract, the lateral corticospinal and anterior, they are also gone. Okay, so the motor activity are also gone. Loss of the bladder and bowel control will be due to the damage to the autonomic tracts which are running through this spinal cord. Then position sense, vibration and light touch are normal due to the intact posterior white column. Position sense, vibration and light touch. This is the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, which at a higher level after relay in the gracile and cuneate nucleus will form the medial lemniscus, which will relay into the thalamus, then to the sensory area of the cerebral cortex. It carries the conscious proprioceptive sensation, sense of position, sense of vibration and sense of light. They are intact because there is no damage in the posterior one-third of the spinal cord. Okay, in the posterior one-third. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, thanks. Okay, I will take the spinal cord, that is the lesion. Okay, say traumatic lesion, that is complete transection, hemisection, like that, of the spinal cord in a separate mm, uh, video, because this was just the vascular supply and we were dealing with the occlusion of the blood vessel or hemorrhage of the blood vessel. Thank you very much for